describe very carefully this idea of natural selection. And so out of that, there comes a set of natural predictions that you can make based on the theory of evolution. One prediction is that there will be a myriad of species, but one species has to evolve, has to change from one state to another state. So, and in between, the theory is that there is a slow change driven by natural selection and random mutations. So what you would expect to find then is some evidence of lots of transition species. So you would expect to find at least some transition species somewhere in the fossil record as you look through it. One prediction is that natural selection will increase this complexity, and however, it's hard to find testable hypothesis in evolution theory. That's one of the biggest problems of it. And in fact, when we look at experiments, there's been numerous experiments with things like fruit flies subject to radiation, things with very fast breeding cycle, and they never actually managed to get them to evolve to a new species. It's never really happened. And one of the things says, well, evolution takes place over such long time scales we can't observe it happening. We can't see it happening. And then we also find the fossil record contains very few transition species. And the ones that we find, we found one leg or one tooth, and there's a lot of conjecture and speculation as to what's going on. So let's look at some of these tests, etc. Evolution itself, I think, evolves to fit the whole theory, evolves to fit every possible fact. Here's one example that was quoted in a source that I read, talks about the peacock. And the peacock has this enormous, elaborate tail. So how would something with the peacock evolve? And so they say, well, it must have been that the female thought that was more attractive, and so they bred only with the males that had the large tails. And so naturally, that ultimately led to these large tails on all of the males. It's hard to imagine how that could have survival value, though, because if you consider this large, clumsy tail, if somebody's chasing it, a predator, then that's going to be the first one to get caught. So that seems to be a little bit in contrast. But nevertheless, their methods for describing when they're presented with that kind of evidence, that kind of fact, it's a story. They tell a story. They don't look for evidence of it. There's no experiment that they consider doing with peacocks. And in fact, they'll take a different bird, which has a very small and very agile, and they'll say its evolutionary advantage was the fact that it had a really small tail and could escape predators easily. So they use the exact same argument with a different story to describe pretty much every fact that they see. So, I mean, so there's a good example. So, evolution science or pseudoscience, can it be falsified? Is there a test that you can think of that would prove that evolution is false? So gradual change, the fact that we don't see any evidence of evolution, that we don't see any change in species from one to the other, that any experiment we do is never sufficient to actually create any kind of change. Now, don't get me wrong, you can get mutations. In fact, in diseases and germs and those kinds of things, there's mutations that happen all the time. But that bacteria never starts to grow legs and wander around the room. It's still a bacteria. There's variation within kind, and there's a lot of variation within kind. So we have the gradual change. Well, that confirms Darwinian evolution. Of course, that's consistent with the theory. But then we see these radical transitions. In fact, if we look in the fossil record, what we see is big groups of species and large populations, and then suddenly there's a whole new group. Just appears almost in the next layer. And so these happen in very short periods of time. Again, now I'm not talking about the sort of timescale debate at this moment. Let's just postulate for the moment the long periods of time is consistent with evolution that is really required for evolution theory. And that's really a different set of arguments and discussion. And I think some people are going to go into that later today. Anyway, but if there's radical condition, then they say, well, we have this, what was one of them? They called it the hopeful monster theory, that there was suddenly a complete being that came along and it didn't ever have eyes before, but suddenly he has eyes. And as a vision scientist these days, I realize the great complexity of eyes. That would be a miracle in itself to have something spontaneously generate eyes. So organism going from the simple to complex, it proves Darwinism. But then if they find one where the earlier organism appears to be more complex, well then if it goes from the complex to the simple, it proves Darwinism. Darwin's mechanism, the individual random mutation, and then later that was became more, they tried to make it more scientific, talking about radiation and cosmic rays and all those kinds of things affecting the DNA. Every experiment they've done with that, they can cause a mutation, but that mutation never is always sterile. It never has any offspring. And it's rarely ever advantageous. Usually it's some kind of deformity that makes that animal very hard to survive, really. But nevertheless, evolution, it's not really limited to the methods of the scientific method. Evolution can use the storytelling approach to explain pretty much anything. Here's another one. Let's see, we've actually talked about this. The end of the Precambrian-ish era is a pretty interesting era. There was a period in a few layers of rock in the fossil record where life suddenly went from some fairly basic forms to this huge explosion. And I think there's some really good ways to explain that with creation theory. But evolution has a hard time explaining that. And it's kind of a set of facts literally cast in stone. We're finding them in the rocks. So, and they seemingly appeared all at once. And so they brought up these things like the punctuated equilibrium. And so they talk about that evolution happens so fast that we can't see it. But wait a minute, didn't they just say that it happens so slow that we can't see it? Oh, okay, doesn't seem to really bother them. Here's one of the best examples that is often used in evolution, is the evolution of the horse. And they have pieced together from, in some cases, just the leg bones, and in other cases, they have fuller skeleton. They pieced together the full, what they call the evolution of the horse, starting from things that looked more like a fox terrier up to the modern horse. And they've put together the sort of family tree of that horse. And some of these things, especially the more recent ones, they've got pretty good evidence on, and there is some good, actually a lot of evidence on. And they clearly are related. So, but if I look at my kids and I look at the patterns in my kid, and I see they all have green eyes and blonde hair, etc., I can say that they're all in my family. But if I were to find the skeletons, I can't prove that one daughter came from the other. I can only say that they're in the same family. You can't ever prove descent because of similarities. And that's a thing which is sort of overlooked a lot of times. Anytime they find something similar, they say, well, that must have come from that. Well, maybe it was in the same family, but there's no proof or evidence at all that it came from that. So, I know it's interesting, some of the quotes that you see. Here's one from this fellow Nilsson. The family tree of the horse is beautiful and continuous only in textbooks, because when they try and put it all together, it never actually quite works. And then there's the platypus, which they haven't been able to figure out what tree to put that one in. There seems to be pieces out there which that one's glommed together from lots of different things, and it's really. And so again, that's one of those, in a good scientific theory, one falsifiable example should have been sufficient to say, we need to relook at this theory. Here's one that I found from the place called the National Center for Science Foundation Education, which, and there, by the way, there's lots of groups that do this, that talk about trying to help teachers explain evolution, because they just need a lot of help in order to do this. And there's a good quote here, is that they hold to a naive view of the nature of science. According to this naive view of the nature of science, there's scientific method, which is this standard kind of involves formulating hypothesis, making predictions, and then going to the laboratory to perform the crucial experiment. So this is from their website. In contrast, the work of evolutionary biologists involves the reconstruction of the past. Methods they use do not conform to the standard view of the scientific method. So their intention is to change our dialogue, to change our discussion of this from being a discussion of the scientific method and how does that fit, to being, oh well, this is all settled. This is settled science. These are evolution is a fact. This isn't a theory anymore. We don't need to verify it. We've determined it's a fact. And so our methods don't need to be the scientific method. Let's use a storytelling method. So anytime we have a new fact, we can create a story about it. So of 10 definitions of those 10 list, and I looked through that list and tried to compare that and confirm by others, but I find that evolution fits 9 very exactly. There's one that talks about it being derived from ancient myths and things like that, which it doesn't quite fit. But of that, it fits 9 out of the 10 definitions. So it's interesting, Darwin himself made a prediction about his theory, and I thought this was an example. It says, if an example can be shown where there are biological structures of such complexity that they could not have arrived by natural means, then the theory would be disproved. So, yet in Michael Behe, one of the founders of a movement called intelligent design, he showed 7 examples of such structures at the most fundamental level. And this is actually an area where I'm studying the eye, and as I study and I learn how incredibly complex the eye is, and not only how complex, but how all the structures work together. I was gone this last week actually at a conference where we presented some of our scientific results from findings and measurements of the eye. And one of the things that we found is that the shape of the cornea of the eye is quite irregular. But the lens inside is also irregular, but it's exactly the opposite way, so the two effects exactly cancel out. And if these were structures that evolved independently and sort of put together, it should have been worse. They should have doubled. They shouldn't have subtracted to 0, et cetera.